Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a video talking about all of the series that I have completed in 2024. I was looking back at my Goodreads and looking at all of the books I'd read this year, and I thought, how many series have I 100%ed, have I completed? And it was actually a significantly higher number than I thought it would be. Usually, I don't think I've finished that many books each year, at least finishing out trilogies and series and stuff, but I made a conscious effort in 2024 to read some trilogies and some 4-book series and to 100% a few things, and I did, and I've 100%ed 10 series. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about each of these very briefly, talk about when I read it, and just talk about my overall thoughts on the series. So let's start with the first series I'm going to talk about, which is the Star Trek series on the list, which is the IKS Gorkin books. You have the first book, A Good Day to Die. I loved it. Top tier Star Trek book for me. And I read this started this at the very end of last year, and then I read both of these this year, and so I completed the series this year. And this book is also on like a same level of like top tier Star Trek. This one was just good. It wasn't amazing, it was just good. But this trilogy was really, really entertaining and really solid. So that's the first series I'm talking about. I also completed the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxies series by Douglas Adams. This is a 5-book science fiction series, pretty famous, very satirical. The first 2 books I read last year, that was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I loved, favorite book in the series, and The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which was okay. And then this year I was like, you know what, I have the books, I just want to finish them out. So I read Life, the Universe, and Everything, which I did not like at all. And then I also this year read So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, which I loved this book. And then I read this year, just recently, Mostly Harmless, which was okay. But I was able to finish out that series. Overall, this is a more frustrating series for me because of how just all over the place it is, and because of the kind of nihilistic nature of the prose. But it still has some entertainment value, at least the first book does. So I at least recommend the first book and the 4th book in the series. So I'll put that series up there. The third series I'll talk about that I 100%ed this year is a fantasy series by Elizabeth Moon, and it's titled The Deed of Paxenarian. The first book is Sheep Farmer's Daughter, which I thought was very good. And then we had Divided Allegiance, and I read that this year, at the beginning of the year. Then I had Divided Allegiance, which I just thought was okay. I didn't dislike it, but I didn't really like it. It was just okay. And then we had Oath of Gold, which was fairly entertaining. And I read all 3 of those books, and so I completed this series this year. And this is something that if you like classic-ish fantasy, very much military fantasy vibes. Book 1 and Book 3 are very much military fantasy, whereas Book 2 is more like a D&D adventure. But still, it's a decent trilogy. It's not a favorite of mine, but it's a decent trilogy. I also read through a Star Wars trilogy, which was the Han Solo trilogy by A.C. Crispin. You have the first book, Paradise Snare, top tier Star Wars book. Then you have the second book, Hutt Gambit. It was okay. And then you had the third book, Rebel Dawn, which was amazing, top tier as well. So these 2 books, loved them absolutely, great books, top, and then Hutt Gambit, which was just okay. It's very rare in Star Wars trilogies like this for me to feel so differently about books. Usually, I feel like all of them are all great or all not so great. So this is one where I feel differently. Books 1 and 3 were great. Books 2 was not great. But I read these. Technically, Book 1 I started at the very end, like the last week of December of last year. But Books 2 and 3 I read in like January, February. So, or maybe it was February, March. Anyway, I read these very early this year. So that is another trilogy that I 100%ed. I also completed the Mars trilogy by Ben Bova. You have the first book is Mars. I read this last year, and it made it onto my top science fiction novels of all time. Right now, as I'm recording this, I consider this to be my number 2 favorite science fiction novel of all time. Read this last year and was like, I have to read more. And so I bought a bunch more Ben Bova books to read, and I read Return to Mars, which was good, and I read Mars Life, which was amazing. This is an amazing book as well. This is like in a similar conversation as Mars. It's of how good it is. So he turned in an okay book and then an amazing book. And he's definitely, Ben Bova's in my top science fiction authors because of this series. And I also read some other books of his that I'm enjoying as well. But even though this is part of his Grand Tour universe, but since it's like the Martian trilogy, basically, it's his sequence of Martian books, I'm counting them together as a series. All right. I also finished a self-published fantasy series, which was the Low Country series by Morgan Shank, who I interviewed Morgan on the channel. You can find my interview with him. Just look up Morgan Shank interview, Jonathan Cohn, you'll find it. And he wrote the first book, A Low Country, which, by the way, the whole trilogy has cover art by Jeff Brown. It's gorgeous cover art. But you have the first book, A Low Trilogy, which I loved. And I read that last year when it came out. Then you had book 2, A Savage Country, which I read last year when it came out, and it was good. Loved it too. And then also loved A Silent Country, which came out this year in like February, and I read it and loved it. And so I finished it this year. And this is a consistent fantasy trilogy. It is, fairly short. It's just under 300 pages for each book, but it is basically a Western fantasy. The first book is a Western with fantasy elements. The second book is kind of a blend, and then the third book is really a fantasy with a few Western elements. So it kind of changes a little bit, but in terms of consistent 9 out of 10 quality, every book in the trilogy is a 9 out of 10. It's a great trilogy. So I highly recommend that if you're looking for some self-published fantasy. I also read Terry Brooks's Word and Void trilogy. This was the most recent series that I completed, and this is an urban fantasy trilogy. It's got like basically it's the word is like the knights, and then the void is like the demons, and they're stuck in this struggle together. And we're following the main character, John Ross, who is trying to protect the people, the everyday people in America. And so the first book is Running with the Demon, which was okay. I read this year. And then we had book 2, Night at the Word, which was okay. And then you had book 3, Angel Fire East, which was okay. None of these books were amazing. None of them were terrible. They were just okay. So that trilogy, not really one I recommend, but this was okay. I 100%ed the whole trilogy in like 3 months. Boom, boom, boom. All right. Now for some middle grade. I finished out a middle grade series this year. We have the series is the Small Spaces Quartet. Hey, it's not a trilogy, it's a quartet. Finally, something different from a bunch of trilogies. Anyway, I read the first 3 books last year. I read or was it 2 years ago? Anyway, I read book 1, Small Spaces. Really enjoyed it. Read books 2, Dead Voices, really enjoyed it. Book 3, Dark Waters, really enjoyed it. This is like a middle grade horror trilogy or tetralogy or quartet. And then book 4 is the only one I read this year because I didn't have it until this year, but it's the final book in the 4-book series, and that's Empty Smiles. And I really enjoyed this series. I think the first book is the best, but I think that books 2 through 4 are still very entertaining. It's basically, there's this villain called the Smiling Man, and he is basically terrorizing a bunch of children, and each book is in a different season. So the first book is a fall book, the second book is a winter book, the third book is a spring book, and the fourth book is a summer book. And it's fun. It's not particularly scary, like, crap your pants stuff, but it's a little scary. So if you're if you're looking for a kids series that's appropriate, it's a very appropriate series. Nothing really bad in there, but still will like maybe get your kid into a little bit of scary stuff. Maybe try this. That's a tetralogy. I also read the Divergent trilogy going into YA. I read the Divergent trilogy. You have the first book, Divergent, which I loved. Book 2, Insurgent, which I loved, and Book 3, Allegiant, which I loved. I loved this whole trilogy. And actually, fun fact, I read Book 1 on the beach on New Year's Day. Or no, it was New Year's Eve. I read it on the beach on New Year's Eve. So I got it in right before the end of the year. And it was a great read. And so normally I was, with most of these series I'm talking about, I read one book a month. So I did like one book in January, one book in February, one book in March. And so that's what I generally, or whatever it was. Maybe it was May, June, July or something. With this trilogy, I read this on New Year's Eve and then read both of these very quickly in early January because they were so entertaining. And I just had to find out what happens next. And so that is the Divergent trilogy. I loved it. Great YA series. I know people are going to hate me for loving this, but I really loved this trilogy. Where am I going to put it? All right. The last series that I completed this year, I've talked about it a lot on the channel, but it's the Twilight series, which I read in its entirety this year. You could say, no, you didn't read Midnight Sun, or you didn't read the something Life of Addie LaRue, whatever. It's a 4-book series. It's the 4 books in the series. I read the 4 books. So the first book is Twilight, which I really enjoyed. I gave this like an 8 out of 10. Really enjoyed it. And, I know that this sappy romance is not for everyone, but it was for me. Then I read New Moon, and New Moon was a step down, but it was still entertaining. But it was, it was like if the first book was an 8 out of 10, I gave this one like a 6. Like it was entertaining, but it wasn't great. And then we had Eclipse, which was very frustrating. I felt very similar in it to New Moon. I did not like what this book did to Jacob. I did not like what this book did to Jacob. Because I thought that New Moon had done great stuff with Jacob, and then I thought Eclipse just tanked him as a character. But my favorite book in the series is the 4th book, Breaking Dawn, which I loved, had such a surprising ending, and was just an entertaining reading experience. It was just fun to read this book, and had some great themes in it, and there's some controversial stuff in this book, but I actually really liked it. So this is a time where I actually liked that she leaned into the controversy here. So I really enjoyed the Twilight saga. I know there's a lot of people online who don't, but I really enjoyed it. And I read all 4 of these books this year. I read a book in February, a book in March, a book in May, and a book in June. So that is the all of the books I read. I finished 10 series. I didn't read the entirety of each series this year, although most of them actually I did read the entirety of it. But all of these series I completed this year so far. Will I be able to complete 10 more in the second half of 2024? Unlikely. Might get a couple more, maybe get up to like 3 or 4 or 5 more. Probably won't do 10 series that I'll complete. But I'm enjoying the books I'm reading. I'm having a blast overall. So if you've read any of these books that I talked about just now, let me know your thoughts on them. Did you complete any series? And this is not all the books I read this year, because I started a bunch of series. I continued in the middle of a bunch of series. I read a bunch of standalones. So I've read a lot more than this, but this is the stuff that I completed, the series that I completed. So if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.